This is impossible, just look at you. You're not normal. Her whisper cut deeper than any shout could have. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind her, and Baek Jin-woo found himself alone in the middle of his penthouse. He didn't go after her. Didn't call out. He just collapsed into the leather armchair, the frame groaning under him. His hands caught his attention, covered in scars, rough as sandpaper, built for hurting people. The butcher, he muttered to the empty room. That's all he was. A monster built for violence. Not someone who got to have love. He closed his eyes tight. A single tear rolled down his stubbled cheek. This wasn't who he was supposed to be. He was meant to be alone. Then he heard the library door creak open. Makena appeared in the doorway, silver tray in hand, her uniform somehow still perfect despite the chaos. She took in the broken glass scattered across the floor. Saw this giant of a man, crying. Anyone else would have backed away slowly. Makena walked right up to him. She put her hand on his shaking fist, steady and warm. Just go, he rasped, his voice barely holding together. Get out before I hurt you too. But Makena didn't flinch. She looked right into the eyes of Seoul's most feared man. You don't scare me, Mr. Baek, she said quietly. You're not a monster. You're just someone who's hurting. For the first time in 40 years, something in him stopped fighting. Ever felt like you were too broken for anyone to want? Before we see how the butcher finally finds his peace, hit subscribe if you're here for stories where even the monster gets his happy ending. To understand why a monster would cry, you need to rewind 30 days. The job interview wasn't really an interview at all, more like a list of warnings delivered without question. The head housekeeper was a woman whose face could have been carved from stone. She didn't ask about Makena's work history. Didn't want references. She just stood there in the middle of that marble foyer and held up 3 fingers. Rule number 1, she said, and her voice bounced off those cold walls. You're invisible here. Mr. Baek doesn't want to be seen. Eyes on the floor. 1 finger down. Rule number 2. The West Wing's off limits after dark. Doesn't matter what you hear. The whole place could be going up in flames, you still don't cross that line. She stopped. The quiet felt thick enough to choke on. Rule number 3. Never mention the scars. You look at them, you talk about them, you're done. Out that same day. Makena stared at the contract sitting on the table. The salary was insane, more in 1 month than she'd make in an entire year back home. Enough to wipe out her father's gambling debts. Enough to give her family a real chance. Being scared was something she couldn't afford right now. She grabbed the pen. Signed her name. Just like that, she'd agreed to become a ghost in some devil's house. The penthouse was this fortress of glass and steel hanging above Seoul. Gorgeous, sure, but cold. Lifeless. For 3 weeks straight, Makena cleaned rooms nobody ever used. Polished silverware that never saw a meal. She only laid eyes on the owner once. He was standing out on the balcony during a storm. Black shirt stretched tight across his shoulders, cigarette burning orange in the rain. The guy was massive, like a mountain that had somehow decided to loom over the city. But even from where she stood, you could feel this loneliness coming off him in waves. He didn't look powerful. He looked like a prisoner doing time in his own home. Then Tuesday night happened. Her digital clock read 2 a.m. The whole place was dead quiet. And then, this sound ripped through the silence. Glass smashing against stone, sharp and violent. A roar followed, deep and raw. Coming from the West Wing. The other maids locked themselves in. They recognized that sound. They knew what it meant, the beast was tearing his cage apart. They buried themselves under blankets and hoped it would stop. But Makena didn't hide. She sat up in bed. Thought about the man she'd seen on that balcony. Thought about the kind of pain that makes someone sound like that. She grabbed the first aid kit from her bathroom. Tied her robe tight. Her heart was going crazy, pounding like it wanted out of her chest. She opened her door. The hallway stretched out dark ahead of her. That entrance to the West Wing waited at the end, forbidden, dangerous. She started walking toward it anyway. The West Wing door was heavy, the kind designed to trap sound inside and keep everyone else out. When Makena pushed it open, the smell was the first thing that hit her. Fresh blood, sharp and metallic, mixing with the burn of expensive whiskey. The room looked like a crime scene wrapped in luxury. The mahogany desk was flipped. A velvet chair lay on its side like a fallen soldier. And in the middle of all that chaos stood Baek Jin-woo. He was breathing hard, his chest rising and falling against a shirt soaked with sweat. His right hand hung loose at his side, blood dripping from a nasty gash across his knuckles onto the marble floor below. When he looked up at her, his eyes were completely unfocused, wild, dilated. Like a cornered animal that would bite if you got too close. Get out, he growled, the sound vibrating deep in her chest. I said leave. Makena didn't step back. She stepped in. Her shoe crunched over broken glass from a shattered whiskey bottle, and the sound seemed to pull him back to reality for a second. He moved toward her then, using every inch of his height like a threat. He was massive, his shadow practically swallowing her whole. Did you hear me? His voice was low, deadly. I will kill anyone who enters this room. Then you'll have to clean up the body yourself, Makena said. Her voice didn't shake. She walked right past him, kicked aside another piece of glass, and set the first aid kit down on a side table. Then she pointed at the sofa. Sit down. You're bleeding all over the rug. Jin-woo just stopped. He blinked like he wasn't sure what he'd just heard. People screamed at him. People begged. People ran. Nobody gave him orders. He stood there, frozen by the sheer audacity of it. Mr. Baek, she said again, sharper this time. Sit. And slowly, like he was moving through water, the giant actually sank onto the sofa. Makena knelt down between his knees and opened the kit. She soaked a cotton ball in iodine, then reached for his injured hand. The size difference was almost absurd. His hand was enormous, scarred, wide, the kind of hand that could crush bone without much effort. Hers looked tiny next to it, dark and soft against his pale, rough skin. She pressed the iodine into the wound. His whole body went rigid, muscles turning to stone, but he didn't pull away. He just watched her. Watched the way her forehead creased when she concentrated. Watched her thread the needle without a single tremor in her fingers. She wasn't shaking. She wasn't looking for an exit. She was just fixing him. You're stitching the butcher, he murmured, and some of the fight seemed to drain out of him. Do you have a death wish? I have a job, she said, tying off the first stitch. And my job is cleaning up messes. This is a mess. She wiped the blood from his wrist with a damp cloth, her touch so light it was barely there. But he felt it like a jolt up his entire arm that had nothing to do with the pain. He stared at the curve of her neck as she worked, caught the faint smell of soap and rain on her skin. It was intoxicating. Dangerous, even. When she finished wrapping the bandage and reached for the scissors, his other hand shot out and grabbed her wrist. His grip was iron, inescapable, terrifying. The air seemed to leave the room all at once. Makena looked up. Her face was inches from his now. His eyes were dark, searching hers for fear, for the crack in the armor, for the lie. Do you know who I am? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper but somehow still dangerous. Do you know what these hands have done? Makena yanked her wrist away from him that night, but the silence she left behind felt heavier than any storm. By morning, the house had changed. It wasn't quiet anymore, it was buzzing with gossip. In the kitchen, the staff were talking in hushed, urgent voices as they chopped vegetables. They went quiet the second Makena walked in, their eyes immediately going to her neck, searching for marks. When she reached for the coffee pot, the cook, an older woman whose face was lined with years of worry, grabbed her arm. You need to be careful, the woman said under her breath. He's not like other men. There's something wrong with him. And then the rumors came pouring out. They said the last woman who got close to him ended up in the hospital. They said he didn't know his own strength. They called him a bull in a china shop, too much force, no control. He breaks everything he touches, the head maid whispered. He's too big. Too rough. A girl like you? He'd tear you apart. Makena ignored them. She kept her chin up and stayed busy. But something in the penthouse had changed. The ghost was coming out of hiding. Baek Jin-woo stopped going to the office. He started prowling around his own home like a caged animal. Wherever Makena went, his shadow followed. She'd be polishing silver in the dining room and feel his eyes burning into her back. She'd turn around, and there he'd be, leaning in the doorway, watching her with a look that was dark and hungry. He didn't say anything. He just watched. The way her hips moved when she walked. The way her hands smoothed the bed sheets. He looked at her like a man dying of thirst who's terrified the water might be poison. He wanted her, that much was obvious, but he kept his distance. He treated himself like a loaded gun, safety on, finger hovering. The tension kept building, pulling tighter and tighter. It finally snapped on a Thursday night in the library. Makena was up on a ladder, dusting the top shelf. Thunder was shaking the windows. She reached for an old leather book, her uniform pulling tight across her ribs. That's when she felt him. The whole room seemed to shift, the air got heavier, charged. She climbed down. He was standing right at the bottom of the ladder. He didn't move. Didn't step aside. He just stood there, blocking her way, This wall of muscle and heat. He was so close. Too close. She could smell him, expensive scotch, tobacco, rain. Makena didn't back down. She looked up at him. He was breathing hard, his chest rising and falling. He lifted his hand, and for a split second she thought he might hit her. Instead, he reached past her head and gripped the ladder, trapping her. He leaned in. His face was just inches from hers. She could feel the heat coming off his skin. He breathed in deep, like he was trying to memorize the smell of her hair. His eyes looked tortured, like he was fighting a war with himself. "You've been listening to them," he said quietly. His voice was low, rough, vibrating through her. "You've heard what they say about me. You can see how big I am." He leaned even closer. His lips barely grazed her ear. The touch sent a shock straight through her. "I'm not a safe man, Makena," he whispered. "I'll destroy you. Run. While you still can." Makena didn't run. She didn't even breathe. She just looked into his eyes and saw a man begging to be saved from himself. The box just appeared on her bed around 5. Heavy velvet, dark and kind of menacing. There was a note on top in this harsh, scratchy handwriting: "Be ready at 7. Wear this." Not asking. Telling. The annual syndicate dinner wasn't some party, it was a feeding frenzy. Every major player in Seoul would show up to size each other up, looking for blood in the water. Jin-woo was done bringing those paid actresses who'd flinch every time he touched them. He wanted someone who wouldn't shrink around monsters. He wanted her. Makena opened the box. The fabric poured out like water. Sapphire blue silk, almost cool against her fingers. She slipped into it. The dress hugged her body, the deep blue incredible against her skin. Backless, bold, sophisticated. She swept her hair up and checked the mirror. The woman staring back was almost a stranger. When she came down the stairs, Jin-woo was already waiting below, messing with his cufflinks. He glanced up. Froze. His breath caught, you could hear it. He just stared, eyes following the line of her neck, how the silk moved with her. For a second, the dangerous man disappeared. Just a guy, completely floored. "You look?" He trailed off, couldn't finish. Just offered his arm. "Stay next to me. Don't talk to anyone unless I say so." The restaurant felt like a cave, all dark wood and cigar smoke. Everything reeked of power and barely concealed threats. Dozens of suits filled the round tables. The second Jin-woo walked in with Makena, the whole place went quiet. Eyes locked on. Whispers started spreading like wildfire. A black woman at the head table? That didn't happen. That was basically a declaration of war. Jin-woo brought her straight to the center table, pulled out her chair himself, which made every other boss in the room tense up. He sat next to her, positioning himself between her and everyone else. Director Choi sat across from them. Snake of a man with these flat, dead eyes. He swirled his wine, staring at Makena with obvious disgust. Waited until the first course came out to make his move. "Mr. Baek," Choi said, voice deliberately loud. "I think there's been some confusion. Staff entrance is around back." He waved his glass toward Makena. "Why'd you bring the maid to dinner? She here to carve the roast?" Dead silence. Makena went rigid, hands balled up in her lap. She braced herself for Jin-woo to send her away. For the humiliation. Jin-woo didn't even look at Choi. Just picked up his steak knife, examined the serrated edge in the candlelight. "She's not staff," Jin-woo said quietly. "Then what's she for?" Choi laughed, scanning the room for backup. "Surely you can afford an actual WOM." It happened so fast. Jin-woo didn't stand. Didn't raise his voice. Just slammed the knife straight down. It went clean through Choi's hand, pinning it to the table. Choi's scream ripped through the room. Blood spread across the white tablecloth, around the expensive plates. Guards grabbed for weapons, but Jin-woo just leaned in, eyes like ice on fire. "She's not the help," Jin-woo said, voice barely above a whisper but somehow deafening. "She's the guest of honor. Apologize, or I take the whole hand." The limo ride home was dead quiet. Jin-woo stared out the window, watching Seoul's lights blur past, sitting so still he could have been carved from stone. But once the rush of violence wore off, his body started cashing checks he couldn't cover. His skin went gray. Sweat broke out across his forehead. The hand that had gripped the knife started shaking. When they got to the penthouse elevator, Jin-woo stumbled. He grabbed for the wall but his legs gave out. That old gunshot wound in his side, the one that never really healed, flared up like someone had pressed a hot iron against it. The fever hit him all at once, a wave of heat that knocked him sideways. "Mr. Baek." Makena was on him in a heartbeat. She shoved her shoulder under his arm and somehow kept him upright. He was pure dead weight, burning up like a furnace, but she got him to the master bedroom. He went down hard on the bed, groaning as everything went black. Makena didn't freak out. She just moved. Jacket off. Shirt unbuttoned. His chest was covered in scars, old ones layered over older ones, a whole history written in scar tissue. But right then, he didn't look dangerous at all. He looked wrecked. She ran to the bathroom and came back with a bowl of cold water and a washcloth. She sat on the edge of the bed, wrung out the cloth, and pressed it against his forehead. The shock of cold snapped his eyes open, but he wasn't really seeing her. He was somewhere else, fighting something she couldn't see. He jerked around, making this low, wounded sound. "Shoo," Makena whispered, running her fingers through his wet hair. "I'm here. You're safe." Something in her voice got through. Jin-woo blinked and his eyes found her face. And then it hit him, this desperate, aching need. 40 years of being touched only when someone wanted to hurt him or use him. He was starving for this. His arm shot out and hooked around her waist. Makena gasped as he pulled her down. He wasn't rough about it, he just held on like she was the only thing keeping him from drowning. He pressed his face into her neck, breathing her in. Soap and skin and something real. His whole body shook against hers. "Don't go," he mumbled, barely getting the words out. "Too dark. Don't go." Makena went stiff for just a second, pinned there under this giant of a man. Then she got it. This wasn't about power or control. This was terror. Pure and simple. He was afraid of the silence, the emptiness. Something in her chest cracked open. She shifted, wrapped her arms around his shoulders, and stroked his hair. "I'm not going anywhere," she said softly. "Sleep, Jin-woo." He let out this long, shaky breath. All the tension drained out of him. He fell asleep holding her like she was the only real thing in a world full of ghosts. Morning light poured through the windows. Jin-woo woke up slowly. The fever was gone. His head was clear. Then he felt the weight on his chest and looked down. Makena was asleep, her cheek pressed against his heart, her hand bunched up in his shirt. Jin-woo didn't move. He just watched her breathe. In and out. Steady and real. His hand, scarred and huge, rested on her back. And right then, he knew. He was completely done for. There was no going back to the way things were. He couldn't let her walk out of this room. He held her a little tighter. The elders could rage all they wanted. The city could burn. None of it mattered. She was his. If you're into the story, hit that like button. Let's get this to 5,000 likes for part 2. The piece didn't even make it to lunch. By noon, the penthouse was swarming with unwanted guests. The council of elders didn't bother knocking, they just showed up like they owned the place. 5 old men in traditional robes, surrounded by guards with guns. They settled onto the Italian leather sofas like they were waiting for someone to die. Jin-woo stood at the window with his back to them. He hadn't slept, but somehow he felt more alert than he had in years. From the kitchen, he could hear Makena humming. That small sound was the only thing in the room that didn't feel cold. "This is completely unacceptable," Elder Park snarled, slamming a folder down on the coffee table. Photos slid out everywhere, Makena at the market, walking into the building, sitting in that sapphire dress. A foreigner? A maid? You're embarrassing this family. The syndicate needs a queen with proper bloodlines, not whatever this is. Jin-woo turned around slowly. His expression was almost bored. "You drove all the way here to criticize my hiring choices? Don't play stupid with us," another elder snapped. "We know she spent the night in your bed. We know you stabbed Director Choi because of her. You're losing focus, Jin-woo. Getting soft." Elder Park leaned in, his voice dropping to something almost snake-like. "We've already made calls to immigration. Her visa could disappear by tomorrow morning. She'll be on a plane home. Or," he paused, a thin smile creeping across his face, "sometimes unauthorized guests have unfortunate accidents." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Jin-woo walked over to the table and picked up the folder. He looked at one of the photos, Makena smiling at something off camera. Then he looked up at Elder Park. A laugh started building in his chest, low and unsettling. It wasn't the kind of laugh that meant anything good. It was the sound of someone realizing their enemies had made a fatal mistake. "You actually think you can threaten me with immigration forms?" Jin-woo asked quietly. He ripped the folder in half. "You think you can touch her?" Park stood up. "You have options here. Step down as chairman. Leave Seoul. Or give up the girl. Pick one." Jin-woo didn't even hesitate. "I pick her." He pulled out his phone and dialed a number, putting it on speaker. Freeze every account connected to the council, he said to whoever answered. Pull their security teams. And send those files on Elder Park's offshore money to the prosecutor's office. The color drained from the elders' faces. You can't do this, Park stammered. This is suicide. You're destroying everything. No, Jin-woo said coldly. I'm just getting rid of dead weight. Get out of my home. And if any of you so much as look at her again, I won't be sending files next time. I'll be sending bodies. The elders practically ran for the door. Jin-woo watched them leave, feeling strangely lighter. He'd just burned his entire empire to the ground for her. Now he needed to find Makena. He had to tell her. Had to warn her that things were about to get a lot more dangerous. But the kitchen was empty. There was a sticky note on the fridge, gone to the market for fresh ginger. Back in 20M. Jin-woo's stomach dropped. He checked his watch. She'd left 30 minutes ago. Down on the street, Makena walked out of the grocery store carrying a paper bag, still thinking about how peaceful Jin-woo looked when he finally slept. The sun felt warm on her face. A black van came out of nowhere, screeching to a stop right next to her. The door flew open. Before she could even process what was happening, hands grabbed her arms and yanked her inside. The bag of ginger hit the ground, spilling across the pavement as the van disappeared into Seoul traffic. Jin-woo found the phone in the gutter. The screen was shattered, a spiderweb of glass reflecting the gray sky. It lay next to the spilled ginger, crushed into the wet asphalt. He picked it up. His hand didn't shake. A terrifying calm settled over him, the kind of stillness that precedes an earthquake. He walked back to his car. The man who had woken up that morning, the man who had felt hope, the man who had held a woman and felt peace, died in that moment. The butcher of Seoul took his place. He sat in the driver's seat and dialed a number. Assemble the wolves, he said. His voice was devoid of humanity. No rules. No limits. Find her. Seoul became a hunting ground. Jin-woo did not go to his office. He went to the underbelly. He kicked open the doors of a gambling den in Incheon managed by Elder Park's nephew. The music cut out. Men scrambled for weapons, but Jin-woo was faster. He moved like a natural disaster, a blur of fists and fury. He grabbed the manager by the throat and slammed him onto the bar, scattering poker chips and glass. Where is she? Jin-woo asked. He didn't shout. He whispered it, which was infinitely worse. I don't know, the man choked, clawing at Jin-woo's iron grip. Please, Chairman. I swear. Jin-woo tightened his grip. Wrong answer. He tore through the city like a wildfire. He broke fingers. He broke jaws. He didn't care about the syndicate's reputation. He didn't care about the police. He didn't care about the money. He had spent his life building an empire of order, and he was tearing it down brick by brick to find one person. In a dimly lit warehouse district, he found a driver who had seen the van. The man tried to run. Jin-woo caught him in the alley. He pinned him against the brick wall, his forearm crushing the man's windpipe. Rain began to fall, mixing with the blood on Jin-woo's knuckles. The van, Jin-woo snarled. Where did it go? The docks, the driver gasped, eyes rolling back in terror. Container 404. It's Director Choi. He has her. Jin-woo dropped the man. He walked back to his car, the rain plastering his hair to his face. He checked the clip of his handgun. He looked at his reflection in the rearview mirror. The eyes staring back were black pits. There was no mercy in them. There was no negotiation. Director Choi had made a fatal error. He thought he had taken a weakness. He thought he could use the girl as leverage. He didn't realize he hadn't taken a hostage. He had stolen the only thing keeping the monster on a leash. And now, the leash was cut. Container 404 reeked of rust and brine. Rain pounded the corrugated roof, drowning out everything else from the harbor. Inside, Director Choi perched on a wooden crate, nursing his bandaged hand. The throbbing pain crawled up his arm and fed something uglier, pure hatred. Makena knelt in the middle of the room, zip ties cutting into her wrists behind her back. But her chin was raised. She wasn't looking at Choi. Her eyes were locked on the steel door. It scraped open with a tortured groan. Baek Jin-woo emerged from the storm, drenched, his suit destroyed, eyes burning with something cold and dead. He came alone. Choi pushed himself up, sneering. He waved at the 4 armed guards circling Makena. The butcher shows up, he said, voice dripping with contempt. No backup. Just you. Jin-woo said nothing. His hand disappeared into his jacket. Every guard tensed, weapons snapping up, fingers hovering over triggers. He pulled out his handgun. held it there for a beat, then opened his palm. The gun hit the concrete with a sharp clatter. He kicked it across the floor. "Let her go," Jin-woo said. His tone was dead calm. "And you get to live?" Choi's laugh was wet and vicious. "You think you're calling the shots here? You stabbed me. Made me look like a fool. Now I'm going to make you watch while I—" He never got to finish. Too busy gloating at the giant. Forgot about the girl. Makena caught the guard on her right glancing at Jin-woo. Just for a second, distracted. There was a half-empty soju bottle sitting on a crate by her knee. She didn't think. She threw her weight sideways, twisted hard, and slammed her forehead into the crate. The bottle teetered. Fell. She caught it with her bound hands and swung upward with everything she had. Glass exploded against the guard's jaw. He screamed, stumbling backward, his gun spraying bullets into the ceiling. Everything erupted. Jin-woo was already moving, a streak of controlled fury. 2 strides and he had the first guard by the throat, slamming him into the metal wall so hard the whole container shuddered. The second guard barely turned before Jin-woo snapped his arm like a twig. Choi scrambled back, clawing for his gun. Too slow. Jin-woo was on him. Didn't even bother hitting him, just grabbed him by the jacket and hurled him bodily through the open door into the rain and darkness. Then, silence. Just the groaning of broken men on the floor. Jin-woo stood there panting, chest rising and falling. He turned slowly. Makena was still kneeling, breathing hard, a thin line of blood on her cheek from flying glass. Jin-woo dropped to his knees in front of her. Yanked a knife from his boot and sliced through the zip ties. He didn't pull her into his arms. Not yet. Instead, he cradled her face in his huge hands, tilting her head gently left, then right, checking for bruises, for breaks, for anything. Those same hands that had just torn through 4 men were shaking like leaves. He couldn't make them stop. "Did they hurt you?" His voice cracked. "Tell me." "I'm okay," Makena whispered, covering his trembling fingers with her own. "Jin-woo. Look at me. I'm fine." He crumpled forward, face buried in her shoulder. The monster was gone. Just a man now, and he was terrified. The sun climbed over the city, but something had shifted. You could almost hear the silence from the Council of Elders, it was that heavy. They huddled in their private tea rooms, eyes fixed on reports from the docks. Director Choi was fighting for his life in intensive care. The hit squad? Shattered. The message couldn't have been clearer. They'd thought the girl made him vulnerable. Turns out, she made him unstoppable. They'd learned the hard way, a monster protecting himself is one thing, but a monster fighting for the person he loves? That's a whole different animal. Just like that, the deportation order disappeared. The threats melted away. Even the underworld knew when to back down. Up in the penthouse, everything looked different. Those heavy velvet curtains that had kept the place dark for years? Torn open. Morning light poured in, chasing away the shadows and warming marble floors that had always felt cold. Gone was the smell of rain-soaked nights and whiskey. Now it was just fresh coffee and something that felt almost like peace. Makena sat right in the middle of it all, claiming that massive dark brown leather armchair, the same one where Jin-woo had sat alone and broken just a month ago. She wasn't in her navy uniform. Instead, she wore one of his white shirts, way too big on her, sleeves rolled up past her elbows. She looked almost swallowed by the chair, but somehow she owned that room. Jin-woo wasn't hovering. Wasn't pacing like he used to. He just sat on the wide armrest beside her, feet on the floor, completely at ease. The look on his face would have scared his enemies half to death, it was total surrender. He held her hand, thumb brushing across her knuckles. Yeah, his face still carried those scars. His hands were still dangerous. But that storm that used to rage behind his eyes? Finally gone. "They're afraid of you now," Makena said quietly, watching the city stretch out below them. "Good. Let them be," Jin-woo murmured, leaning his forehead against her shoulder. "As long as you're safe, they can shake in their boots for all I care." He caught his reflection in the window. The butcher of Seoul had disappeared. In his place was just a man who'd finally found where he belonged. Everyone told her he was a monster. She just knew he needed someone to believe in him first. And that's the story of how the butcher of Seoul gave away his heart. What was your favorite part? Drop it in the comments. And hey, click the next video if you want to see another powerful guy meet his match.